Populism is a word that has lost most of its meaning for the average American. Aside from the rare high school lecture on the subject, very few Americans know of it in detail. Indeed, it is a doctrine that has very nearly reached the status of obscurity, being studied almost exclusively by academics. What is so startling about this development is that the word possessed such resonance. It held such sway over millions of Americans and elicited vibrant emotions, both of adulation and anger. This word very nearly, and as many would argue, in fact did, change the world. Indeed, 5 years after its creation, the People's Party elicited 1,041,028 votes and seized 13 congressional seats and 1,500 local seats. Although the populist movement had its main thrust in only 2 decades of American history, from 1880 to 1900, they had a profound effect upon the larger American political culture. Despite having failed in their electoral ambitions, they nevertheless helped to shape future doctrines, policies, and what is considered to be acceptable in American rhetoric. Despite populism's importance, the research conducted on the subject tends to be somewhat problematic. As William P. Tucker put it in 1947, despite the fact that the United States was still recently a rural society, surprisingly little systematic research and writing has been done on the history of American farm organizations. Although significantly more work has been done on the subject since 1947, there still exist problems in the scholarship. In particular, the research tends to become bogged down in the minutiae of election results and membership statistics, and while no doubt important, the significance of populism is to be found in its ideological thrust and not in its electoral ambitions. John D. Hicks, in his seminal work, The Populist Revolt, falls into this trap, although he does discuss for a time the ideological underpinnings of the movement. Nevertheless, most of the book is devoted to political minutiae. Ultimately, the problem seems to come down to looking at the trees instead of the forest, for although each given tree is important, it is the forest as a whole that is significant. Given the significance of populism, there continues to be an active debate over the central thrust of the populist message. Was it essentially reactionary and nativist, or progressive and economic? Was it an ambivalent conservatism, as Karel D. Bicha describes it, the last gasp of a dying rural order? Or was it, as Norman Pollock wrote, a progressive social force deeply committed to freedom? Had populism, in the time it existed, won triumphantly in the end, populistic doctrines showing an amazing vitality, or were they indicative of a missed opportunity of a significant magnitude? It is of interest to note a shift in the historiographical discussion on the subject. Earlier writers, Hicks among them, tended to focus upon the minute details so as to understand the concrete backgrounds of the movement, the railroads, the debts, the booms, the busts. And as such, the debate at the time focused around what exactly motivated the populists to take up the cause. The emphasis which has been placed upon the financial phase of the populist movement, Haley Farmer writes, has tended to obscure other points in the populist program. It is in all reality irrelevant if the populists cared more about railroad regulation than the number of grain elevators, or if they were more inclined to support the sub-treasury plan over the idea of free silver and bimetallism. These are points that must invariably be discussed, but the significance of the movement does not hinge upon these points. The ideological thrust of populism is what is of importance now. In particular, the most important aspect of populism's ideology, the keystone, as it were, without which the ideology itself would lack its power, lies in the hands of the American farmer. Farmers possess a particular place in the pantheon of heroes in the American imagination. From the earliest days of the Republic, the Jeffersonian image of the yeoman farmer has dominated the American sense of freedom and independence. Thomas Jefferson summed up this attitude concisely in 1781. Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people, whose breasts he has made his particular deposit for substantial and genuine virtue. It is the focus in which he keeps alive that sacred fire which otherwise might escape from the face of the earth. This Jeffersonian attitude, this cultural imperative that equated a healthy society with an agricultural economy, has dominated the American imagination, even up to the modern day. Indeed, in our now modern lifestyles, we often yearn for the seeming quaintness of simple farm life, and reams of poetry lament the loss of seeming innocence of rural life. In the mid-19th century, particularly from 1861 to 65, the sense of American nationalism began to shift. With federal powers solidified by the defeat of the Confederacy, and thousands of soldiers returning from the front lines with a new sense of identity and unity, with the passage of the Homestead Act in 1862, and with the linking of the Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads in 1869, the way was set for a new generation of Americans to conquer a new frontier with a new sense of nationalist identity. Land in the Great Plains that was once considered to be a great desert turned out to be quite fertile, leading to a near rush to acquire as much land as possible. The railroads stood to gain the most from this land rush, and they were granted, in the aggregate, 129 million acres of public lands by the federal government. Along with these vast tracts of land, as one contemporary writer noted, $50 million were loaned outright by the government, but not 1 cent of that great loan has ever been paid. But of course, railroads can only make money if there is freight to be had, and as such, their prerogative was to create as many farm and mining towns throughout the West as possible. The only way to achieve this goal was, of course, to sell off the land that had been granted to them. As such, they engaged in a massive advertising campaign, sending the message that prosperity was to be had in the West throughout the United States, and even as far-flung as Europe. "Follow prairie dogs and Mormons, and you will find good land," ran one such advertisement. Another advertisement by the Union Pacific described the Platte Valley as a flowery meadow of great fertility, clothed in nutritious grasses and watered by numerous streams. The advertisements, printed far and wide, attempted to counteract the myth in the popular imagination of the great American desert. They did so by going to the complete opposite end of the spectrum and portraying the Great Plains as a veritable Eden, a near utopia where anyone could start a new life. What is more, the railroads recruited the territorial governments of the West to assist them in this endeavor, doing what they could to encourage immigration. The Kansas State Board of Agriculture declared in effect that farming in Kansas would result in a life of ease, perpetual June weather, milk, and honey. Another such advertisement, printed by the Union Pacific in 1883, declared that nature seems to have provided protection and food for man and beast. All that is required is diligent labor and economy to ensure an early reward. Millions of dollars were spent to help create this perception. Such advertisements helped propagate get-rich-quick schemes that would become ingrained in the Western legacy. With a veritable flood of migrants crossing the Mississippi to establish homesteads and towns, the railroads were handing out land grants like candy. Prices for the land varied from as low as 25 cents an acre to the common price of between $1.25 an acre and $2.50 an acre. What is more, the railroads offered credit for those who could not afford even such modest sums, allowing poorer persons to acquire land and pay off the debts over a 3 to 5 year period with an abnormally low interest rate. Thanks to the concerted joint efforts by the railroad companies and the state governments of the region, the population of the western states skyrocketed. Between 1870 and 1880, Kansas saw a 173.4% increase in their population, while the Dakota Territory and Nebraska witnessed a 853.2% and a 267.8% increase, respectively. The shattering of the myth of the Great American Desert was directly caused by both the advertising produced by the railroads as well as an unusual amount of rainfall experienced in the 1870s. Thanks to this unusual rain, many farmers boomed, many making so much in their first season to fully pay off their farm loans. The farmers were not the only ones flourishing. The region also experienced a cattle boom in the same decade that brought more than 2 million head of cattle onto Rocky Mountain rangeland. What is more, railroads also boomed at the same time. With massive loans being handed out from the federal government, there existed an ever-growing incentive to lay track for the sake of laying track. As such, many miles of track were laid by such fly-by-night operations that only sought to obtain the funds from the government. Such railroads very often did not follow beeline routes, and instead often lay track in overly circuitous routes solely in order to increase their mileage. What is more, very often these type of railroads had no destination, or a destination that had no justifiable traffic. The 1894 report of the Kansas Railroad Commission observed that it is probable in many cases that the parties building a railroad could afford to throw away the entire cost of construction and still realize a very handsome return on their outlay. Furthermore, many towns in the West actively encouraged railroads opening railheads and laying track, as the town's importance rested upon the size of its rail yard. Towns issued thousands of dollars worth in municipal bonds to fund such endeavors. One local newspaper man wrote in order to encourage such government spending, "Do not be afraid of going into debt. Too much cannot be spent this year if properly applied. Let the bugaboo of high taxes be nursed by old women. Do all you can for Belle Plain, Kansas, regardless of money, and let the increase of population and wealth take care of the taxes." The end result of this artificial stimulus was that between 1880 and 1890, over 5,708 miles of track were laid in Kansas, 3,773 in Nebraska, and 4,327 miles were laid in Dakota. The Great Plains in the 1870s and 1880s experienced an artificially created financial bubble. A bubble that was created through the manipulations of credit and public perception by both railroad companies and local governments, as well as upon an unusually wet decade. But invariably, this all came to an end. The deflationary period in the currency began in 1887 and would continue for another decade. This became problematic as dollars were raised in value, but the amounts of dollars for debts remained the same. As one commentator at the time described the situation, it required twice as many bushels of wheat to pay a debt in 1887 as it did to pay a debt in the same amount in 1867. What is more, the overly abundant rainfall also ceased. Only 2 years between 1887 and 1897 provided enough rain to grow a full crop. For 5 years of that decade, very nearly no crops grew whatsoever. Not only the farmers suffered, the blizzards of 1866 to 67 were as equally destructive as the drought that followed. Because the land was overstocked and overgrazed, a few seasons of drought and blizzard completely destroyed the open range industry. The bubble burst, bringing very nearly everyone crashing down. They had come forth with with a profound sense of hope, were substantially let down in a heavy-handed manner. Thousands abandoned their farms and tried to flee back east in the same covered wagons that had brought them west with so much hope. In God we trusted, in Kansas we busted, wrote one farmer on his wagon. Half of the people living in western Kansas fled the collapsing bubble between 1888 and 1892. It seemed that everyone was suffering from the collapse. Everyone save the industrialists. The capital that had flowed so easily from the east now receded, leaving the farmers to fend for themselves. The farmers, facing a near depression, began to organize local farmers' alliances in order to educate each other, to collaborate in joint ventures, and to try to better their welfare through collective action. Frank Bassel Tracy describes this initial development quite succinctly. Their crops failed, they were in want, and had little money, and their produce brought low prices. Distress and discontent came, and clamors for assistance arose. The farmers' alliances very quickly turned their interest from self-help to political gains and political help. The alliances, which before the crisis had no political goals, now very quickly saw politics as the sole solution to their woes. As McVeigh observed in 1896, the farmer came to believe it to be a matter of necessity that a political party should be formed to right his wrongs, which he considered political and not economic. This new political movement was growing quickly. They saw themselves as a group of persons who had been, in effect, sold out, and not due to any fault of their own. The bubble had collapsed not because the workers had not worked their hardest, but rather because of the negligence and even malice of the economic and political powers outside the region. As the great populist orator Mary Elizabeth Lease declared, Wall Street owns the country. It is no longer a government of the people, by the people, and for the people, but a government of Wall Street, by Wall Street, and for Wall Street. The great common people of this country are slaves, and monopoly is the master. The West and South are bound and prostrate before the manufacturing East. Money rules, the parties lie to us, the common people are robbed to enrich their masters. The new party saw themselves as standing opposed to this colossal conspiracy that sought to enslave them. They saw the People's Party as a movement of the masses, an uprising of the people, and the people, not the politicians, would direct it. They saw themselves as much more than reformers, but as revolutionaries. By 1892, within 2 years of the formation of the People's Party, 4 national conventions had been held to help direct the long-term goals of the party and to establish a common doctrine. The Omaha Convention, held on July 4, 1892, was the most formative of the populist ideology. It is often contended that the Omaha platform became what is in effect orthodox populism. The first 2 planks of the platform are more or less formalities. First of all, declaring a solidarity and a union of the labor forces that shall be permanent and perpetual. Specifically, this pertained to the united effort and collaboration between the Farmers' Alliance and the Knights of Labor. The second plank was simply a declaration of the supremacy of the workers in the economy, declaring that wealth belongs to him who creates it, and disregarding the role of capital in the industrial process. Only with the subsequent planks does one get into the meat of populist demands. The third plank calls for the complete nationalization of all railroads. Many different historians have taken note of the fact that among all the issues raised by the various populist conventions and platforms, the question of the railroads is one of the few that remains constant and is consistently presented as the most prominent and pressing issue. As a petition from the Dakota's Farmers Alliance put it succinctly, railroad discrimination and extortion constitute the question of the day. The general perception was that while the so-called monopoly powers as a whole represented a return to all the despotisms of the past,
creating a nation of browbeaten slaves that will produce wealth for a handful of soulless tyrants. The power of the railroads in particular was seen as a cardinal sin against morality. The railroad system, declared the platform of the Nebraska People's Party, is a system of spoliation and robbery. The reasons for this hostility are multifaceted, but ultimately boil down to an overall sense that the companies cheated the farmers at every turn. Whether it is favoring grain elevators and shipping rates and prices, or charging seemingly exorbitant prices for shipping, or purposely downgrading grain at purchase to get a cheaper price from the farmers. Consistently, the farmers of the West felt exploited by Eastern capitalists. Another issue raised, which would become the pivotal issue for the populist message in 1896, was that of the unlimited coinage of silver. Populists hoped to remonetize silver along the traditional 16-to-1 ratio and put an end to the deflationary trend and to help farmers out of their debt crisis. Though it was an important issue, for early populists there was a clear division between the free silverites and the sub-treasury plan. Moreover, they saw the railroad as a more pressing issue. As populism evolved in the following years, however, the silver issue eventually assumed the forefront of the populist message, becoming a near battle cry. Free silver became the keystone to the populist program. Without it, they argued, nothing else would be achieved. Only when we have restored the money of the Constitution, Jennings Bryan declared, all other necessary reforms will be possible. But until this is done, there is no other reform that can be accomplished. The Omaha platform made another number of other demands for the liberalization of the American political system, but none of which would significantly set them apart from other left-leaning political movements of the time. But what is important to note is that with the Omaha platform and the issues of the railroads and free silver in their belts, the ideological backbone of populism was realized, and they were ready to do battle with the old parties. The ideological framework of the populist movement is somewhat of an abnormality in American political life. Indeed, this is not a new perception. This attitude was felt at the time. As McVeigh writes, populism is indeed a phenomenon in American politics. As was noted earlier, there has been an extensive academic debate as to where on the political spectrum populism would lie. A debate over whether or not populism was left or right is silly at best, mainly because they were neither. The populists were both. They were what analysts of later political movements have called the third way. For at the same time, the populists adhered to a strong sense of individualism and entrepreneurism and respect for private property. On the other hand, populists believed in the exercise of national authority in any and every case where the general welfare will be promoted. This seemingly odd dichotomy is best observed in Thomas E. Watson's statement in 1892. The interference with the free action of the citizen always resulted in centralized government, in a monopoly of riches, in the concentration of capital, or privilege and of power which destroyed those countries. The only way to escape its perils is to retrace our steps. Unfetter the hands of men, unshackle the exchanges of producers, and let every man exchange his commodities with his fellow men upon the terms which his own good judgment dictates. This mix of both progressive and reactionary rhetoric is problematic for a traditional political interpretation, but it is not irreconcilable. The closest comparable political movement that is at all compatible with would be the Left Libertarians, or the anarcho-socialists, i.e., Non-Marxist socialism. A key factor in this odd mix of left and right is the fact that populism developed in largely rural areas. Being in the Midwest farmland, the radicalism of the movement was, almost by necessity, tempered with an overarching sense of religiosity. This, of course, flew in the face of more orthodox socialistic trends and even in the face of secular labor movements. Indeed, the rhetoric of the populists everywhere had an overarching religious and near-apocalyptic ring. As William Allen White observed in 1901, populism was a fanaticism like the Crusades. Sacred hymns were torn from their pious tunes to give place to words which deified the cause and made gold and all its symbols diabolical. The populists very often likened themselves to crusaders or to the armies of God, who were meant to do battle with the powers of evil. Indeed, Mary Lease went so far as to claim that Wall Street, the satanic money power, was in actuality the great red dragon that was foretold in Revelations. For the populists, the plutocrats represented the handmaidens of the devil himself, whereas in their view, the People's Party is in accord with the right and justice. It is in accord with the teachings of Christ. If you vote for any other party, you vote for a hell upon earth. Lorenzo Llewellyn defined the contest at hand as being a contest between exquisitely refined barbarism and the noonday light and love of Christian charity and progressive civilization. Mary Lease again continues this theme of there being a conflict between the Christian populists and the heathen old parties. They have set up statute laws against the natural rights of man, and thus, through his image, they strike at God. So the populists of today represent a demand for the enactment into law of the truths taught by Jesus, the truths which must prevail before Christ's kingdom can be established and the earth made a fit abode for man. Even those populists who saw their plight as hopeless, such as Socialist Jerry Simpson, nevertheless issued the call to arms. For us who have taken up the crusade, there shall be no halting. We should close up, shoulder to shoulder, and show an unbroken line to the enemy. The populists all expounded a profound sense of self-righteousness. Famously, William Jennings Bryan, debatably the most lackluster populist, called the cause of populism a cause as holy as the cause of humanity, and then invoked the image of Christ when he declared that you shall not press down upon the brow of labor this crown of thorns. You shall not crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. The populists consistently make the claim that the old parties represent vice and only the populists represent virtue. In many ways, it does not represent a political stratagem. Although the religious rhetoric did help to define the larger populist movement culture, i.e., the unifying thread of consistency within the group, it appears that they truly believed what they were saying. The populists came from all regions of the country and from many different denominations, and even went so far as to insult the institutionalized church, one poet describing preachers as being backwards bigots with shrill, fanatic voices. It is common for historians to look upon rhetorical nuances with a grain of salt, going so far as to state that such rhetoric is cynically used to exploit the prejudices of the people. But seeing the consistency with which the populists use their religiosity, it is very difficult to levy this charge against them. The religious thread running through the populist message is undeniable, and it is of overwhelming significance. But along with this religious message, there is a socialistic thread running through populism. From their call for the nationalization of the railroads and the telegraphs, to their denunciations of Wall Street as a gang of plutocrats, there's a very strong left-leaning tendency in populist rhetoric. In particular, there is a very strong sense of fraternity and philanthropy. William Peffer expressed this best in 1896. Populists, as opposed to Republicans, believe that every child has exactly equal rights, that the interests of all the people are superior to the interests of the few, that what a man honestly earns is his, and that the populists were made up of citizens who believe in doing good because they love their fellow men. There is also an overarching sense of solidarity between the farmers and the industrial workers within populism. As Bryan declared in his famous speech in 1896 that the populists have behind us the producing masses of the nation and of the world, the laboring interests, the toilers everywhere. But what is important to note is that the socialism of populism was non-Marxist in nature. Victor Furcus explains part of the reason quite well when he observes that the class struggle throughout American history has traditionally been waged not by laborers against employees, but by debtors against creditors. As was stated earlier, there are differing interpretations of how the Populists affected the American political scene overall. Normally, the debate polarizes between those who say the Populists ultimately only propped up the status quo, i.e., Gene Clanton, or those who say that they effected a tumultuous upturn. Thinkers like Murray Rothbard held this view. In the United States, the classical Liberal Party had long been the Democratic Party, known in the latter 19th century as the Party of Personal Liberty. Basically, it had been the party not only of personal, but also of economic liberty. It construed state power to be negligible and federal power to be virtually non-existent. On foreign policy, the Democratic Party, though less rigorously, tended to be the party of peace, anti-militarism, and anti-imperialism. But personal and economic libertarianism were both abandoned with the capture of the Democratic Party by the Bryan forces in 1896, and the foreign policy of non-interventionism was then rudely abandoned by Woodrow Wilson 2 decades later. It was to usher in the new corporatist statism of a welfare-warfare state run by an alliance of big government, big business, unions, and intellectuals. The two interpretations posited by Clanton and Rothbard are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Populism represented the beginning of what later historians would call the progressive era. However, populism failed to garner support when it was solely interested in agrarian issues. Only after its merge with the Democrats did it begin to augment itself and appeal more to urbanites in the middle class. The Democrats, as Rothbard aptly observes, began to act with a much more militaristic and interventionist air. In one case in particular, with the Spanish-American War, William Peffer declared that his tacit support of the endeavor, and Socialist Jerry Simpson was the only populist in Congress to vote no on the declaration of war. By the time of the First World War, William Jennings Bryan, the Secretary of State under Wilson, did not object. The Populists further deeply influenced later policies. In particular, the trust-busting of Teddy Roosevelt, the centralization of the Wilson administration, and the proto-welfare state developed by FDR's New Deal. The People's Party of America represented a fundamental shift in the way in which political discourse was conducted in American society, and the perception of what is and what is not a legitimate function of the state. Within a few short years, they helped to set the political trend for the next century. The Populists supplanted the status quo of the 19th century and in effect replaced it with the political status quo of the 20th century. The policies that the Populists inspired, which were radical at the time they were implemented, are now cornerstones of modern American politics. Even Ronald Reagan, the paragon of American conservatism, lauded the wisdom of Roosevelt and refused to make cuts in Social Security. Though populism no longer possesses the resonance it used to hold in the minds of millions of Americans, today the seeds that they have planted have come to fruition, and very soon the American government shall reap what it has sown.